morning, all. On this day, April 13th, 1850, the Pony Express rider was greeted by a cheering crowd in Sacramento, California, after completing the first complete relay of the trail. The mail left St. Joseph, Missouri on April 3rd. 10 days, 40 riders, and nearly 180 horses later, the mail traveled a stretch of nearly 2,000 miles. Former rider Ponyboy Peterson here with more.
Thank you for coming on the show, Ponyboy Peterson. Just a first question for you to get us started. Why was this started? How did all of this happen?
All right. So let me just step outside. Can you see me in my yard with the buffaloes?
Yes.
Well, during the decades before, thousands of people moved west in search of opportunity. Some were in search of gold, some looking for religious freedom, such as the Mormons who settled in Utah. These settlers created an increased demand for the mail service from the east. Before the Pony Express, mail was sent by boat and took up to 3 months' journey around South America or over the Isthmus of Panama. Overland mail delivery by stagecoaches took about 3 weeks and was also susceptible to bad weather and attacks from Native Americans. The Pony Express was the fastest way for the West and the East to communicate in a time before the radio and telephone. However, this service only ran for 18 months. Operations came to a halt once the transcontinental telegraph was constructed, allowing for even faster and inexpensive communication. After 3 years, also 3 years later, the Transcontinental Railroad would begin its construction. Despite the short-lived run, the failure to make a profit, the Pony Express lived on in history as a symbol of the American West.
Ponyboy, thank you for all that information, and I love your style. The hat looks really nice. I'm curious about who could be a rider. So can you give me a little information on who these people were?
Orphans were preferred. Riders had to be experienced, brave, and tiny, like a modern-day jockey between 100 and 125 pounds. Although the average age of a rider was 20, many riders were as young as 14 years old. Riders had to take an oath that they would not drink alcohol, they would not fight, or use any profane language. Some notable riders include Buffalo Bill Cody, who went on to become one of the most famous figures of the West, and Pony Bob Haslam, who delivered the news of Lincoln's victory.
Well, Ponyboy, what a view. What was it actually like on the trail?
Well, although the riders faced really extreme conditions, it was actually more dangerous to be a station attendant. They were sitting ducks and were frequently attacked by Native Americans and other robbers. Somewhere around 190 relief stations were set up along the trail. Each rider rode around 100 miles and changed horses every 10 miles. A similar delivery method was also used by Genghis Khan and the Mongols hundreds of years earlier. Also, the Chasqui of the Inca Empire used a similar relay system, except for they were traveling by foot and they were going on sketchy mountain passes. Today, there are over 120 historic sites you can visit, including relief stations and possible segments of the original trail. Each year, the National Pony Express Association holds a re-ride, where 650 riders participate in a 10-day reenactment to deliver mail from Sacramento to St. Joseph.
Well, thank you very much for that lesson, Ponyboy. Now, the Pony Express was a massive historical failure. It lasted only about 18 months, being surpassed by the telegraph. And during that time, it lost $200,000, which would be millions of dollars in today's money. Thank you again, Ponyboy.
Thank you.
Ponyboy.
Tuning into the next part of the Social Studies Department show will be the History Maker Madness. In the History Maker Madness, we will be pitting various historical figures against each other to see who is the champion. We have a variety of different categories, including peacemakers, conquerors, inventors, villains, artists, thinkers, explorers, and politicians. To explain the game, I'm going to throw it over to Mr. Peterson.
So each week we will share a Google form with you on Google Classrooms, and you will be able to vote on each of the matchups in each round. So the first round, the matchup that I'm going to be looking at is going to be between a couple villains. I'm looking at Rasputin versus Osama bin Laden. We have Rasputin, the Russian mystic, against Osama bin Laden, famous terrorist. But what intrigues me about this is that it is the Battle of the Beards. Mr. Adams, what matchup are you looking at in the first round?
Well, thank you for asking, Mr. Peterson. There's many intriguing matchups to choose from. One that really got my attention from the explorers category is Neil Armstrong versus Marco Polo. This is unique because they're so very different. Neil Armstrong, of course, being the first man to step foot on the moon, and then Marco Polo in his trades and exploring in the Far East and China region. So this one is titled Space versus Spice. Mrs. Berry, what matchup's been standing out to you?
All right. Thank you, Mr. Adams. I decided to go with a couple of people from the villains category. I am looking at Jim Baker versus Jim Jones. I wanted to look at two people that are fraudsters and created cult-like groups. So I am calling this the Battle of the Jimmies. How about you, Miss Blue?
All right. So I am over here looking at politicians. And what interests me is the matchup between Winston Churchill and Margaret Chase Smith. Churchill was the Prime Minister of England who led the UK to victory in World War II, loved his cigars, always had a stogie in hand, versus Margaret Chase Smith, Senator from Maine, who took on McCarthy during the Red Scare. And what do you think, Mr. Hargrove?
Well, I'm going to stay there in the politicians section, and I'm going to look at the Battle of the Bees. That would be Lyndon B. Johnson versus Bibi Netanyahu, or Benjamin Netanyahu. Lyndon B., of course, was president of the United States after Kennedy was assassinated, and Benjamin Netanyahu is a hard-line conservative in Israel, dealing with the politics between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And that sets up our week one matchup. So, Mr. Peterson, any final words?
Just looking forward to see who the students vote for, who makes it on to the second round. And then next week, we'll give you the matchups that we're looking at in the second round.
All right, signing off.